So a man with a bulging waistline decided he was finally going to do something about his weight. And one of the interventions he decided to do was to take a different route to work so he wouldn't go by his favorite donut shop. He also told his coworkers of his plan, and he asked for their encouragement and prayers. So they were very surprised when only a few days later he showed up with a box of donuts. They said, "What's going on?" He said, "These aren't ordinary donuts. These are from the Lord." And they said, "What in the world are you talking about?" And he explained that on his way to the office that day, he had forgotten and gone by that same donut shop and looked in the window and saw dozens of donuts, glazed and sprinkles, calling his name. And he realized he was being tempted, so he prayed for deliverance and strength. And he said, "Lord, if you want me to have these delicious donuts, you're going to have to give me a parking spot right in front of the store." So after the 8th trip around the block, so today we come to the end of our journey with the Lord's Prayer, but hopefully we continue to pray this prayer. And today I want to look at the last 2 lines. "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever." And I want to work backwards. I want to start with the last phrase and end with "lead us not into temptation." So let's begin. Thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Now you've heard the Gospel of Matthew text 5 times. How many times have you heard myself or Liz say these words? Not once. You don't find these words in the original text. There are some Bibles, some later manuscripts where it's been weaved in, but you don't find it in the text because it's not there. In fact, it's been borrowed from 1 Chronicles, where David says words very similar to that when he is standing on the very site that will be the place where the temple will be built by his son. It's called the Doxology, and it's a fitting addition, and it's particularly fitting as we get ready for Holy Week, which begins on Palm Sunday, where 2 different visions of kingdom and power and glory is contrasted for us for all time. And Paul is doing something similar in his letter to the Ephesians. He is using military imagery, breastplates, swords, armor, but he's repurposing that towards the way of Christ, which is the same thing that Jesus is doing when he rides into Jerusalem while all the Jews are in town celebrating the Passovers, and Rome is threatened by all of these people of faith there, and Jesus comes in as a humble king on a donkey, and they cheer, "Hosanna! Here's the Messiah. Here is the King of the Jews." And historians tell us that every year at that same time, as the Jews were celebrating their liberation, there was another procession coming into Jerusalem, and it was the Roman cavalry showing off their force and their might, their armor, ensuring that these Jews would not rebel against Caesar. Different understandings of kingdom, different understandings of power, different understanding of glory. Thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory, not our kingdom, not our power, not our glory, but God's. Which leads to the second phrase, deliver us from evil. I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and I want you to think about these questions and answer them in your own heart. Do you believe your favorite opinion maker on your favorite cable news TV channel, the best one, the one that you turn to, do you believe their number one priority is to tell you the truth? Do you believe the stock market and big pharma or big tech care first and foremost about your health and wholeness? Do you believe big government or the military-industrial complex, or the Hollywood entertainment industry cares first and foremost about you and has at their heart your best intention. If you're hesitating to say yes to any of those, then you are already closer to what Paul wants us to see about the cosmic forces of this present darkness, about the powerful forces and authority at work in all kinds of ways in our culture. As Christians, we are called to take evil seriously and to recognize how evil hides in good, partial goods. Evil is subtle. It disguises itself. It's found in the places where we might not always look for it. But as Christians, we're taught to see how good things like the media or the economy or the government can become bad things. We're taught to see how industries that have generally improved the quality of our lives can also be incredibly destructive to our health and wholeness. We need to see the mixed motives of big business. That's part of, I think, what Paul is inviting us to see, that evil is subtle. It hides out in partial goods. N.T. Wright, a contemporary theologian, says that we have three different responses to evil, to the face of evil. And he calls the first one the head in the sand approach. Some of us live more regularly in that place, but this is the approach that denies the power of evil, particularly systemic evil. And these are the people who really say, you know what, evil's not that bad. It's just a couple of bad apples, a couple of bad actors that are making things bad. And if we just weed those people out and try a little bit harder, everything's going to be great. To which N.T. Wright responds, that's kind of like believing that if your house is on fire, all you got to do is take off a layer of clothing and drink a glass of water. The head in the sand approach. Do you put your head in the sand in the face of evil? The second temptation, which is the mirror opposite, is the wallowing in evil, seeing evil running rampant all over the place. Harvard professor Arthur Brooks talks about the growing outrage industrial complex. I love that phrase. The outrage industrial complex which we see on the right and on the left in our politics. These are the forces at work in your life and mine who want us to see our political opponents as evils that need to be eradicated. This manufactured contempt, which we're all tempted towards, destroys not only the hated, it destroys the haters. And it makes political compromise and progress nearly impossible. That's the second approach to evil, to wallow in it. But the third temptation is the one that Jesus spoke the most about. And that's the temptation to self-righteousness. It's the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. The tax collector who understands his mixed motives, who understands how he is in some ways a tool of the empire, even though he's a Jew, and he confesses, he repents. But the Pharisee says, thank God I'm not like him. Self-righteousness. Yes, evil is present, but it's out there. It's in them. It's in that group, that tribe. It's not in me. And that is the most pernicious temptation. That's the one that destroys so much. And that's the one Jesus challenges us against. So as Christians, we're called to take evil seriously, but there's a nuance here. To not wallow in it and take it so seriously. Because we're also called to remember that God in Jesus has come to conquer the power of sin and death and evil, and to show us the way that we can participate in the power of God. That's where Paul is leading us. He's saying, put on the whole armor of God. Put on the whole armor of non-violent love and resistance. Join God in overcoming evil, not through evil, but through good. And that way will always look a lot like a humble king riding in on the back of a donkey, and not like a Roman battalion with all its military force. This week, Congress unanimously or near unanimously passed the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Bill, which had languished in Congress for over a century. Near unanimous. Think of how unusual that is in the climate we are today. And we were reminded of Emmett Till's mother, who made the strategic decision that has the aroma of Holy Week and Palm Sunday and Good Friday, when she decided that the body of her precious son, her 14-year-old son, who was lynched for offending a white woman in a grocery, she made the decision that he would be laid in an open casket so everyone could see what evil is capable of. That's a powerful way to understand Jesus on the cross. For all eternity, giving us a vision of what we're doing to ourselves, to each other, to the divine, the sacred. An open casket. Which leads to the third phrase, lead us not into temptation. Now, I got to be honest, I have struggled with this. And it was comforting to know that I'm not the only one. In fact, people have been struggling with this from the very beginning. Theologian and Christian leaders as far back as the 2nd century. African theologian Tertullian wrote these words. He shuddered at the thought that God would seem to tempt us, as if God were ignorant of our limits to our faith, or worse, eager to overthrow our faith. It's been important for me to dig a little bit more into the Greek here, and the word periosmos, which is translated temptation, can be translated in different ways. It can be translated as enticement to sin, or temptation or being brought to trial. Those are really different concepts. Do you believe that God is enticing you to sin, whispering in your ear, tempting you to do evil? Or do you believe God has created temptations and recognizes that you and me, we can't grow up until we learn how to face temptations? And these temptations, these trials, are to strengthen and build up our dependence upon God and our faith. You may recall that 3 of the Gospels start with a very elaborate depiction of Jesus being led by the Spirit into the wilderness, where he's tempted by the tempter, by Satan, by the devil. An important nuance. God leads us perhaps into temptation, but it's the devil who tries to entice us to sin. The author of James, one of the letters in the Bible, addresses this issue as well, and he says words that are also helpful. He said, "Blessed is anyone who endures temptation. For no one who is tempted should say, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil. And he himself tempts no one towards evil. But one is tempted by one's own desire, being lured and enticed by it. And when that desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin." God doesn't entice you or me to sin, but God does tempt us and test us, and that testing is redemptive. As Abraham finds out when he is tested to sacrifice his son in a horrifying story in the Old Testament, but he is tested to show forth his faith. As Timothy is tested by Paul and encouraged to see the spiritual life as an athletic contest, and he had to be trained up into godliness. And as Martin Luther said so beautifully of his temptations, he said, "My temptation has been my master of divinity." Temptations test boundaries. They help us discover our strengths and our weakness, and they show us the limitations of our morality, all of which can be really good and helpful. I think God allows us temptation not out of some warped desire to get us or to push us to the extreme, to break us and to overwhelm our faith. No, but because God believes that temptation, rightly faced and understood, can strengthen our faith, help us understand ourselves, help us come upon our need for God. For God knows how we deal with the small temptations, form the patterns and the habits that help us deal with the big stuff that will, if it hasn't already, come our way. As we come to understand the ways we are tempted, we can better understand the ways that we are conditioned by forces that don't have our best intentions at heart. I love this image by sociologist Peter Berger, who says that the first step towards freedom is looking up and seeing all the strings that are trying to control us. Those are the powers and principalities that we don't always see. And we need to see them as Christians. We need to recognize how evil uses good things to control and shape our perceptions and drive our actions. But here's the good news. Here's the good news. God's not a grand puppeteer. God is not one of those strings in your life, and in your childish moments, you have asked God to be that puppet, right, or be the master puppeteer. But God refuses to take on that role and chooses to influence us, which is a lot different than forcing us to do what God would have us do. God has given us the gift of free will. And each day, that's the burden we carry. That's the burden. And each day, we're faced with choices to do right or wrong. And truth be told, how often are our motives a little bit of everything? More mixed than we would admit to ourselves and to others. And how often, even when we do the right thing, we may do it for the wrong reasons. Or we may do it at the right time and insist it has to be now. Maybe the biggest temptation we all face is that we convince ourselves that we are doing things with pure motives, for pure love of God and pure love of neighbor. Richard Rohr suggests that the Lord's Prayer was given to us by Jesus to keep us humble and honest and unpretentious, to enable us to be more conscious of mixed motives and confused actions. And he says, maybe lead us not into temptation could be translated, lead us away from the illusions about ourselves that keep us doing evil, often in the name of God, and calling it virtue. As we come to the end of the Lord's Prayer, we realize that it's not enough to just recite it, to memorize it, although that's important. But we're called to live it, to embody that prayer, for it is a living prayer. It wants to come alive in us. And even though we begin with our Father who art in heaven, it ends on earth. It ends with you and with me. Preacher Tom Long offers this way of understanding the last phrase, and it's to envision us going out into the world, as we will later today, ready to do God's work in a storm-tossed world, while whispering, "Keep us safe, O God. Let the forces of evil tremble at our coming, and not the other way around. And may we come home again tonight, even stronger in faith than we went out. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen.